The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 9, Side 2. Originally, he seems to have been a god of thunder, dwelling in the hills, and worshipped for the same reason that the youthful Gorky was a believer when it thundered. The authors of the Pentateuch, to whom religion was an instrument of statesmanship, formed this Vulcan into Mars, so that in their energetic hands Yahweh became predominantly an imperialistic expansionist god of hosts, who fights for his people as fiercely as the gods of the Iliad. "The Lord is a man of war," says Moses, and David echoes him, "He teacheth my hands to war." Yahweh promises to destroy all the people to whom the Jews shall come, and to drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite by little and little. And he claims as his own all the territory conquered by the Jews. He will have no pacifist nonsense. He knows that even a promised land can be won and held only by the sword. He is a god of war because he has to be. It will take centuries of military defeat, political subjugation, and moral development to transform him into the gentle and loving father of Hillel and Christ. He is as vain as a soldier. He drinks up praise with a bottomless appetite, and he is anxious to display his prowess by drowning the Egyptians. "They shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh." To gain successes for his people, he commits or commands brutalities as repugnant to our taste as they were acceptable to the morals of the age. He slaughters whole nations with the naive pleasure of a Gulliver fighting for Lilliput. Because the Jews commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab, he bids Moses take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun. It is the morality of Ashurbanipal and Ashur. He offers to show mercy to those who love him and keep his commandments, but, like some resolute germ, he will punish children for the sins of their fathers, their grandfathers, even their great-great-grandfathers. He is so ferocious that he thinks of destroying all the Jews for worshipping the golden calf, and Moses has to argue with him that he should control himself. "Turn from thy fierce wrath," the man tells his God, "and repent of this evil against thy people." And the Lord repented of the evil which he thought to do unto his people. Again, Yahweh proposes to exterminate the Jews root and branch for rebelling against Moses, but Moses appeals to his better nature and bids him think what people will say when they hear of such a thing. He asks a cruel test, human sacrifice of the bitterest sort, from Abraham. Like Moses, Abraham teaches Yahweh the principles of morals and persuades him not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there shall be found 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 good men in those cities. Bit by bit he lures his God towards decency and illustrates the manner in which the moral development of man compels the periodical recreation of his deities. The curses with which Yahweh threatens his chosen people if they disobey him are models of vituperation, and inspired those who burned heretics in the Inquisition or excommunicated Spinoza. "Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. The Lord shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, tumors, and with the scab, and with the itch, whereof thou canst not be healed. The Lord shall smite thee with madness, and blindness, and astonishment of heart. Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed." Yahweh was not the only God whose existence was recognized by the Jews or by himself. All that he asked in the first commandment was that he should be placed above the rest. "I am a jealous God," he confesses, and he bids his followers utterly overthrow his rivals and quite break down their images. The Jews before Isaiah seldom thought of Yahweh as the God of all tribes, even of all Hebrews. The Moabites had their god Chemosh, to whom Naomi thought it right that Ruth should remain loyal. Beelzebub was the god of Ekron. Milcom was the god of Ammon. The economic and political separatism of these peoples naturally resulted in what we might call their theological independence. Moses sings in his famous song, "Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods?" And Solomon says, "Great is our God above all gods." Not only was Tammuz accepted as a real god by all but the most educated Jews, but his cult was at one time so popular in Judea that Ezekiel complained that the ritual wailing for Tammuz's death could be heard in the temple. So distinct and autonomous were the Jewish tribes that even in the time of Jeremiah many of them had their own deities. "According to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah." And the gloomy prophet goes on to protest, against the worship of Baal and Moloch by his people. With the growth of political unity under David and Solomon, and the centering of worship in the temple at Jerusalem, theology reflected history and politics, and Yahweh became the sole God of the Jews. Beyond this Henotheism, they made no further progress towards monotheism until the prophets. Henotheism is a clumsy but useful word coined by Max Müller to designate the worship of a god as supreme, combined with the explicit, as in India, or tacit, as in Judea, admission of other gods. Even in the Yahvistic stage, the Hebraic religion came closer to monotheism than any other pre-prophetic faith, except the ephemeral sun worship of Ikhnaton. At least equal as sentiment and poetry to the polytheism of Babylonia and Greece, Judaism was immensely superior to the other religions of the time in majesty and power, in philosophic unity and grasp, in moral fervor and influence. This intense and somber religion never took on any of the ornate ritual and joyous ceremonies that marked the worship of the Egyptian and Babylonian gods. A sense of human nothingness before an arbitrary deity darkened all ancient Jewish thought. Despite the efforts of Solomon to beautify the cult of Yahweh with color and sound, the worship of this awful divinity remained for many centuries a religion of fear rather than of love. One wonders, in looking back upon these faiths, whether they brought as much consolation as terror to humanity. Religions of hope and love are a luxury of security and order. The need for striking fear into a subject or rebellious people made most primitive religions cults of mystery and dread. The Ark of the Covenant, containing the sacred scrolls of the law, symbolized by its untouchability the character of the Jewish creed. When the pious Uzzah, to prevent the ark from falling into the dust, caught it for a moment in his hands, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him there for his error, and there he died. The central idea in Judaic theology was that of sin. Never has another people been so fond of virtue, unless it was those Puritans who seemed to step out of the Old Testament with no interruption of Catholic centuries. Since the flesh was weak and the law complex, sin was inevitable, and the Jewish spirit was often overcast with the thought of sin's consequences, from the withholding of rain to the ruin of all Israel. There was no hell in this faith as a distinctive place of punishment, but almost as bad was the Sheol, or land of darkness under the earth, which received all the dead, good and wicked alike, except such divine favorites as Moses, Enoch, and Elijah. The Jews, however, made little reference to a life beyond the grave. Their creed said nothing of personal immortality, and confined its rewards and punishments to this mundane life. Not until the Jews had lost hope of earthly triumph did they take over, probably from Persia and perhaps also from Egypt, the notion of personal resurrection. It was out of this spiritual denouement that Christianity was born. The threat and consequence of sin might be offset by prayer or sacrifice. Semitic, like Aryan sacrifice, began by offering human victims. Then it offered animals, the first fruits of the flocks, and food from the fields. Finally, it compromised by offering praise. At first, no animal might be eaten unless killed and blessed by the priest, and offered for a moment to the god. Circumcision partook of the nature of a sacrifice and perhaps of a commutation. The god took a part for the whole. Menstruation and childbirth, like sin, made a person spiritually unclean, and necessitated ritual purification by priestly sacrifice and prayer. At every turn, taboos hedged in the faithful. Sin lay potential in almost every desire, and donations were required in atonement for almost every sin. Only the priests could offer sacrifice properly or explain correctly the ritual and mysteries of the faith. The priests were a closed caste, to which none but the descendants of Levi could belong. They could not inherit property, but they were exempt from all taxation, toll, or tribute. They levied a tithe upon the harvests of the flocks, and turned to their own use such offerings to the temple as were left unused by the god. After the exile, the wealth of the clergy grew with that of the renascent community. And since this sacerdotal wealth was well administered, augmented, and preserved, it finally made the priests of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, as in Thebes and Babylon, more powerful than the king. Nevertheless, the growth of clerical power and religious education never quite sufficed to win the Hebrews from superstition and idolatry. The hilltops and groves continued to harbor alien gods and to witness secret rites. A substantial minority of the people prostrated themselves before sacred stones, or worshipped Baal or Astarte, or practiced divination in the Babylonian manner, or set up images and burned incense to them, or knelt before the brazen serpent or the golden calf, or filled the temple with the noise of heathen feasting, or made their children pass through the fire in sacrifice. Even some of the kings, like Solomon and Ahab, went a-whoring after foreign gods. Holy men like Elijah and Elisha arose who, without necessarily becoming priests, preached against these practices and tried by the example of their lives to lead their people into righteousness. Out of these conditions and beginnings, and out of the rise of poverty and exploitation in Israel, came the supreme figures in Jewish religion, those passionate prophets who purified and elevated the creed of the Jews and prepared it for its vicarious conquest of the Western world. 4. The first radicals. The class war, origin of the prophets, Amos at Jerusalem, Isaiah, his attacks upon the rich, his doctrine of a Messiah, the influence of the prophets. Since poverty is created by wealth and never knows itself poor until riches stare it in the face, so it required the fabulous fortune of Solomon to mark the beginning of the class war in Israel. Solomon, like Peter and Lenin, tried to move too quickly from an agricultural to an industrial state. Not only did the toil and taxes involved in his enterprises impose great burdens upon his people, but when those undertakings were complete, after 20 years of industry, a proletariat had been created in Jerusalem which, lacking sufficient employment, became a source of political faction and corruption in Palestine, precisely as it was to become in Rome. Slums developed step by step with the rise of private wealth and the increasing luxury of the court. Exploitation and usury became recognized practices among the owners of great estates and the merchants and moneylenders who flocked about the temple. The landlords of Ephraim, said Amos, sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes. This growing gap between the needy and the affluent, and the sharpening of that conflict between the city and the country which always accompanies an industrial civilization, had something to do with the division of Palestine into two hostile kingdoms after the death of Solomon. A northern kingdom of Ephraim, with its capital at Samaria, and a southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. From that time on, the Jews were weakened by fraternal hatred and strife, breaking out occasionally into bitter war. Shortly after the death of Solomon, Jerusalem was captured by Sheshank, Pharaoh of Egypt, and surrendered to appease the conqueror nearly all the gold that Solomon had gathered in his long career of taxation. It was in this atmosphere of political disruption, economic war, and religious degeneration that the prophets appeared. The men to whom the word, in Hebrew Nabi, was first applied were not quite of the character that our reverence would associate with Amos and Isaiah. Some were diviners who could read the secrets of the heart and the past and foretell the future according to remuneration. Some were fanatics who worked themselves into a frenzy by weird music, strong drink, or dervish-like dances, and spoke, in trances, words which their hearers considered inspired, that is, breathed into them by some spirit other than their own. Jeremiah speaks with professional scorn of every man that is mad and maketh himself a prophet. Some were gloomy recluses, like Elijah. Many of them lived in schools or monasteries near the temples, but most of them had private property and wives. From this motley crowd of fakirs, the prophets developed into responsible and consistent critics of their age and their people, magnificent street-corner statesmen who were all thoroughgoing anti-clericals and the most uncompromising of anti-Semites, a cross between soothsayers and socialists. We misunderstand them if we take them as prophets in the weather sense. Their predictions were hopes or threats or pious interpolations, or prognostications after the event. The prophets themselves did not pretend to foretell so much as to speak out. They were eloquent members of the opposition. In one phase they were Tolstoyans, incensed at industrial exploitation and ecclesiastical chicanery. They came up from the simple countryside and hurled damnation at the corrupt wealth of the towns. Amos described himself not as a prophet, but as a simple village shepherd. Having left his herds to see Bethel, he was horrified at the unnatural complexity of the life which he discovered there, the inequality of fortune, the bitterness of competition, the ruthlessness of exploitation. So he stood in the gate and lashed the conscienceless rich and their luxuries. Forasmuch therefore as your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burdens of wheat, ye have built houses of hewn stone, but ye shall not dwell in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink wine of them. Woe to them that are at ease in Zion, that lie upon beds of ivory, and stretch themselves upon their couches, and eat the lambs out of the flock, and the calves out of the midst of the stall. That chant to the sound of the viol, and invent to themselves instruments of music, like David. That drink wine in bowls, and anoint themselves with the chief ointments. I despise your feast days, saith the Lord. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. This is a new note in the world's literature. It is true that Amos dulls the edge of his idealism by putting into the mouth of his God a Mississippi of threats, whose severity and accumulation make the reader sympathize for a moment with the drinkers of wine and the listeners to music. But here, for the first time in the literature of Asia, the social conscience takes definite form, and pours into religion a content that lifts it from ceremony and flattery to a whip of morals and a call to nobility. With Amos begins the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of his bitterest predictions seems to have been fulfilled while Amos was still alive. Thus saith the Lord, As the shepherd taketh out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, so shall the children of Israel be taken out that dwell in Samaria in the corner of a bed, and in Damascus in a couch. And the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall have an end. The reference is apparently to the room made entirely of ivory in the palace at Samaria where King Ahab lived with his painted queen Jezebel, circa 875 to 850 B.C. Several fine ivories have been found by the Harvard Library expedition in the ruins of a palace tentatively identified with Ahab's. About the same time, another prophet threatened Samaria with destruction in one of those myriads of vivid phrases which King James's translators minted for the currency of our speech out of the wealth of the Bible. The calf of Samaria, said Hosea, shall be broken into pieces, for they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. In 733, the young king of Judah, threatened by Ephraim in alliance with Syria, appealed to Assyria for help. Assyria came, took Damascus, subjected Syria, Tyre, and Palestine to tribute, made note of Jewish efforts to secure Egyptian aid, invaded again, captured Samaria, indulged in unprintable diplomatic exchanges with the king of Judah, failed to take Jerusalem, and retired to Nineveh laden with booty and 200,000 Jewish captives doomed to Assyrian slavery. It was during this siege of Jerusalem that the prophet Isaiah became one of the great figures of Hebrew history. The book that bears his name is a collection of prophecies, that is, sermons, by 2 or more authors ranging in time from 710 to 300 B.C. Chapters 1 through 39 are usually ascribed to the first Isaiah, who is here discussed. Less provincial than Amos, he thought in terms of enduring statesmanship. Convinced that little Judah could not resist the imperial power of Assyria, even with the help of distant Egypt, that broken staff which would pierce the hand that should try to use it, he pled with King Ahaz, and then with King Hezekiah, to remain neutral in the war between Assyria and Ephraim. Like Amos and Hosea, he foresaw the fall of Samaria and the end of the northern kingdom. When, however, the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem, Isaiah counseled Hezekiah not to yield. The sudden withdrawal of Sennacherib's hosts seemed to justify him, and for a time his repute was high with the king and the people. Always his advice was to deal justly, and then leave the issue to Yahweh, who would use Assyria as his agent for a time, but in the end would destroy her too. Indeed, all the nations known to Isaiah were, according to him, destined to be struck down by Yahweh. In a few chapters, 16 through 23, Moab, Syria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Babylon, and Tyre are dedicated to destruction. Every one shall howl. This ardor for ruination, this litany of curses, mars Isaiah's book as it mars all the prophetic literature of the Bible. Nevertheless, his denunciation falls where it belongs, upon economic exploitation and greed. Here his eloquence rises to the highest point reached in the Old Testament, in passages that are among the peaks of the world's prose. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof, for ye have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. What mean ye, that ye beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor? Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, to turn aside the needy from judgment, justice, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. And what will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from afar? To whom will ye flee for help, and where will ye leave your glory? He is filled with scorn of those who, while fleecing the poor, present a pious face to the world. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams, and the fat of fed beasts. Your appointed feasts my soul hateth. They are a trouble unto me. I am weary to hear them. And when ye spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Wash ye, make ye clean, put away the evil of your doings from before mine eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, justice. Relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. He is bitter, but he does not despair of his people, just as Amos had ended his prophecies with a prediction, strangely apt today, of the restoration of the Jews to their native land. So Isaiah concludes by formulating the messianic hope, the trust of the Jews in some Redeemer who will end their political divisions, their subjection, and their misery, and bring an era of universal brotherhood and peace. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. For unto us a child is born, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. With righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. It was an admirable aspiration, but not for many generations yet would it express the mood of the Jews. The priests of the temple listened with a well-controlled sympathy to these useful encouragements to piety. Certain sects looked back to the prophets for part of their inspiration, and perhaps these excoriations of all sensual delight had some share in intensifying the desert-born Puritanism of the Jews. But for the most part the old life of the palace and the tent, the marketplace and the field, went on as before. War took its choice of every generation, and slavery continued to be the lot of the alien. The merchant cheated with his scales, and tried to atone with sacrifice and prayer. It was upon the Judaism of post-exilic days, and upon the world through Judaism and Christianity, that the prophets left their deepest mark. In Amos and Isaiah is the beginning of both Christianity and socialism, the spring from which has flowed a stream of utopias, wherein no poverty or war shall disturb human brotherhood and peace. They are the source of the early Jewish conception of a Messiah who would seize the government, re-establish the temporal power of the Jews, and inaugurate a dictatorship of the dispossessed among mankind. Isaiah and Amos began in a military age the exaltation of those virtues of simplicity and gentleness, of cooperation and friendliness, which Jesus was to make a vital element in his creed. They were the first to undertake the heavy task of reforming the God of hosts into a God of love. They conscripted Yahweh for humanitarianism, as the radicals of the 19th century conscripted Christ for socialism. It was they who, when the Bible was printed in Europe, fired the Germanic mind with a rejuvenated Christianity and lighted the torch of the Reformation. It was their fierce and intolerant virtue that formed the Puritans. Their moral philosophy was based upon a theory that would bear better documentation, that the righteous man will prosper and the wicked will be struck down. But even if that should be a delusion, it is the failing of a noble mind. The prophets had no conception of freedom, but they loved justice and called for an end to the tribal limitations of morality. They offered to the unfortunate of the earth a vision of brotherhood that became the precious and unforgotten heritage of many generations. 5. The death and resurrection of Jerusalem. The birth of the Bible, the destruction of Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the second Isaiah, the liberation of the Jews, the second temple. Their greatest contemporary influence was on the writing of the Bible. As the people fell away from the worship of Yahweh to the adoration of alien gods, the priests began to wonder whether the time had not come to make a final stand against the disintegration of the national faith. Taking a leaf from the prophets, who attributed to Yahweh the passionate convictions of their own souls, they resolved to issue to the people a communication from God himself, a code of laws that would reinvigorate the moral life of the nation, and would at the same time attract the support of the prophets by embodying the less extreme of their ideas. They readily won King Josiah to their plan, and about the 18th year of his reign the priest Hilkiah announced to the king that he had found in the secret archives of the temple an astonishing scroll in which the great Moses himself, at the direct dictation of Yahweh, had settled once and for all those problems of history and conduct that were being so hotly debated by prophets and priests. The discovery made a great stir. Josiah called the elders of Judah to the temple, and there read to them the Book of the Covenant, in the presence, we are told, of thousands of people. Then he solemnly swore that he would henceforth abide by the laws of this book, and he caused all that were present to stand to it. We do not know just what this Book of the Covenant was. It may have been Exodus, chapters 20 to 23, or it may have been Deuteronomy. We need not suppose that it had been invented on the spur of the situation. It merely formulated and put into writing decrees, demands, and exhortations which for centuries had emanated from the prophets in the temple. In any event, those who heard the reading, and even those who only heard of it, were deeply impressed. Josiah took advantage of this mood to raid the altars of Yahweh's rivals in Judah. He cast out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal. He put down the idolatrous priests, and them also that burned incense unto Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the planets. He defiled Tophet, that no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire to Moloch. And he smashed the altars that Solomon had built for Chemosh, Milcom, and Astarte. These reforms did not seem to propitiate Yahweh or bring him to the aid of his people. Nineveh fell as the prophets had foretold, but only to leave little Judah subject first to Egypt and then to Babylon. When Pharaoh Necho, bound for Syria, tried to pass through Palestine, Josiah, relying upon Yahweh, resisted him on the ancient battle site of Megiddo, only to be defeated and slain. A few years later, Nebuchadrezzar overwhelmed Necho at Carchemish and made Judah a Babylonian dependency. Josiah's successors sought by secret diplomacy to liberate themselves from the clutch of Babylon and thought to bring Egypt to their rescue, but the fiery Nebuchadrezzar, getting wind of it, poured his soldiery into Palestine, captured Jerusalem, took King Jehoiakim prisoner, put Zedekiah on the throne of Judah, and carried 10,000 Jews into bondage. But Zedekiah too loved liberty or power, and rebelled against Babylon. Thereupon Nebuchadrezzar returned, and, resolving to settle the Jewish problem once and for all, as he thought, recaptured Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, destroyed the Temple of Solomon, slew Zedekiah's sons before his face, gouged out his eyes, and carried practically all the population of the city into captivity in Babylonia. Later, a Jewish poet sang one of the world's great songs about that unhappy caravan. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. In all this crisis, the bitterest and most eloquent of the prophets defended Babylon as a scourge in the hands of God, denounced the rulers of Judah as obstinate fools, and advised such complete surrender to Nebuchadrezzar that the modern reader is tempted to wonder, could Jeremiah have been a paid agent of Babylonia? I have made the earth, the man, and the beast that are upon the ground, says Jeremiah's God, and now have I given all those lands under the hand of Nebuchadrezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and all nations shall serve him. And it shall come to pass that the nation and kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadrezzar, the king of Babylon, and that will not put their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation will I punish, saith the Lord, with the sword, and with the famine, and with the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. He may have been a traitor, but the book of his prophecies, supposedly taken down by his disciple Baruch, is not only one of the most passionately eloquent writings in all literature, as rich in vivid imagery as in merciless abuse, but it is marked with a sincerity that begins as a diffident self-questioning, and ends with honest doubts about his own course and all human life. Woe is me, my mother, that thou hast borne me, a man of strife, and a man of contention to the whole earth. I have neither lent on usury, nor men have lent to me on usury, yet every one of them doth curse me. Cursed be the day wherein I was born." A flame of indignation burned in him at the sight of moral depravity and political folly in his people and its leaders. He felt inwardly compelled to stand in the gate and call Israel to repentance. All this national decay, all this weakening of the state, this obviously imminent subjection of Judah to Babylon, were, it seemed to Jeremiah, Yahweh's hand laid upon the Jews in punishment for their sins. "Run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now, and know, and seek in the broad places thereof, if ye can find a man, if there be any that executeth judgment, that seeketh the truth, and I will pardon it." Everywhere iniquity ruled, and sex ran riot. Men were as fed horses in the morning, every one neighed after his neighbor's wife. When the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem, the rich men of the city, to propitiate Yahweh, released their Hebrew slaves. But when for a time the siege was raised and the danger seemed past, the rich apprehended their former slaves and forced them into their old bondage. It was a summary of human history that Jeremiah could not bear silently. Like the other prophets, he denounced those hypocrites who, with pious faces, brought to the temple some part of the gains they had made from grinding the faces of the poor. The Lord, he reminded them, in the eternal lesson of all finer religion, asked not for sacrifice, but for justice. The priests and the prophets, he thinks, are almost as false and corrupt as the merchants. They, too, like the people, need to be morally reborn, to be, in Jeremiah's strange phrase, circumcised in the spirit as well as in the flesh. "Circumcise yourselves to the Lord, and take away the foreskins of your heart." Against these abuses the prophet preached with a fury rivaled only by the stern saints of Geneva, Scotland, and England. Jeremiah cursed the Jews savagely, and took some delight in picturing the ruin of all who would not heed him. Time and again he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity in Babylon, and wept over the doomed city, whom he called the daughter of Zion, in terms anticipatory of Christ. "Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people." To the princes of Zedekiah's court all this seemed sheer treason. It was dividing the Jews in counsel and spirit in the very hour of war. Jeremiah tantalized them by carrying a wooden yoke around his neck, explaining that all Judah must submit, the more peaceably the better, to the yoke of Babylon. And when Hananiah tore this yoke away, Jeremiah cried out that Yahweh would make yokes of iron for all the Jews. The priests tried to stop him by putting his head into the stocks, but from even that position he continued to denounce them. They arraigned him in the temple and wished to kill him, but through some friend among the priests he escaped. Then the princes arrested him and lowered him by ropes into a dungeon filled with mire. But Zedekiah had him raised to milder imprisonment in the palace court. There the Babylonians found him when Jerusalem fell. On Nebuchadrezzar's orders they treated him well and exempted him from the general exile. In his old age, says Orthodox tradition, he wrote his Lamentations, the most eloquent of all the books of the Old Testament. He mourned now the completeness of his triumph and the desolation of Jerusalem, and raised to heaven the unanswerable questions of Job. "How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How she is become as a widow, she that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary? Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow. Righteous art thou, O Lord, when I plead with thee. Yet let us talk with thee of thy judgments. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously?" Meanwhile, in Babylon, another preacher was taking up the burden of prophecy. Ezekiel belonged to a priestly family that had been driven to Babylon in the first deportation from Jerusalem. He began his preaching, like the first Isaiah and Jeremiah, with fierce denunciations of idolatry and corruption in Jerusalem. At great length he compared Jerusalem to a harlot because she sold the favors of her worship to strange gods. He described Samaria and Jerusalem as twin whores. This word was as popular with him as with the dramatists of the Stuart Restoration. He made long lists of the sins of Jerusalem, and then condemned her to capture and destruction. Like Isaiah, he doomed the nations impartially and announced the sins and fall of Moab, Tyre, Egypt, Assyria, even of the mysterious kingdom of Magog. But he was not as bitter as Jeremiah. In the end he relented, declared that the Lord would save a remnant of the Jews, and foretold the resurrection of their city. He described in vision the new temple that would be built there, and outlined a utopia in which the priests would be supreme, and in which Yahweh would dwell among his people forever. He hoped with this happy ending to keep up the spirits of the exiles and to retard their assimilation into the Babylonian culture and blood. Then as now it seemed that this process of absorption would destroy the unity, even the identity of the Jews. They flourished on Mesopotamia's rich soil, they enjoyed considerable freedom of custom and worship, they grew rapidly in numbers and wealth, and prospered in the unwonted tranquility and harmony which their subjection had brought to them. An ever-rising proportion of them accepted the gods of Babylon and the Epicurean ways of the old metropolis. When the second generation of exiles grew up, Jerusalem was almost forgotten. It was the function of the unknown author who undertook to complete the book of Isaiah to restate the religion of Israel for this backsliding generation, and it was his distinction in restating it to lift it to the loftiest plane that any religion had yet reached amid all the faiths of the Near East. We know nothing of the history of this writer who, by a literary device and license common to his time, chose to speak in the name of Isaiah. We merely guess that he wrote shortly before or after Cyrus liberated the Jews. Biblical scholarship assigns to him chapters 40 through 55, and to another and later unknown or unknowns, chapters 56 through 66. While Buddha in India was preaching the death of desire, and Confucius in China was formulating wisdom for his people, this second Isaiah, in majestic and luminous prose, announced to the exiled Jews the first clear revelation of monotheism, and offered them a new God, infinitely richer in loving kindness and tender mercy than the bitter Yahweh even of the first Isaiah. In words that a later gospel was to choose as spurring on the young Christ, this greatest of prophets announced his mission, no longer to curse the people for their sins, but to bring them hope in their bondage. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. For he has discovered that Yahweh is not a God of war and vengeance, but a loving Father. The discovery fills him with happiness and inspires him to magnificent songs. He predicts the coming of the new God to rescue his people. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. Behold, the Lord God will come with strong hand, and his arm shall rule for him. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm, and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. The prophet then lifts the messianic hope to a place among the ruling ideas of his people, and describes the servant who will redeem Israel by vicarious sacrifice. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Modern research does not regard this servant as the prophetic portrayal of Jesus. Persia, the second Isaiah predicts, will be the instrument of this liberation. Cyrus is invincible. He will take Babylon and will free the Jews from their captivity. They will return to Jerusalem and build a new temple, a new city, a very paradise. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like a bullock, and dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, saith the Lord. Perhaps it was the rise of Persia and the spread of its power, subjecting all the states of the Near East in an imperial unity vaster and better governed than any social organization men had yet known, that suggested to the prophet the conception of one universal deity. No longer does his God say, like the Yahweh of Moses, I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me. Now it is written, I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God besides me. The prophet-poet describes this universal deity in one of the great passages of the Bible. Who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing, and vanity. To whom then will ye liken God, or what likeness will ye compare with him? It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. Lift up your eyes on high, and behold who hath created these things. It was a dramatic hour in the history of Israel, when at last Cyrus entered Babylon as a world conqueror, and gave to the exiled Jews full freedom to return to Jerusalem. He disappointed some of the prophets, and showed his superior civilization by leaving Babylon and its population unhurt, and offering a skeptical obeisance to its gods. He restored to the Jews what remained in the Babylonian treasury of the gold and silver taken by Nebuchadrezzar from the temple, and instructed the communities in which the exiles lived to furnish them with funds for their long journey home. The younger Jews were not enthusiastic at this liberation. Many of them had sunk strong roots into Babylonian soil, and hesitated to abandon their fertile fields and their flourishing trade for the desolate ruins of the holy city. It was not until 2 years after Cyrus's coming that the first detachment of zealots set out on the long 3-month journey back to the land which their fathers had left half a century before. They found themselves, then as now, not entirely welcome in their ancient home, for meanwhile other Semites had settled there, and had made the soil their own by occupation and toil. And these tribes looked with hatred upon the apparent invaders of what seemed to them their native fields. The returning Jews could not possibly have established themselves had it not been for the strong and friendly empire that protected them. The prince Zerubbabel won permission from the Persian king Darius I to rebuild the temple. And though the immigrants were small in number and resources, and the work was hindered at every step by the attacks and conspiracies of a hostile population, it was carried to completion within some 22 years after the return. Slowly Jerusalem became again a Jewish city, and the temple resounded with the psalms of a rescued remnant resolved to make Judea strong again. It was a great triumph, surpassed only by that which we have seen in our own historic time. 6. The people of the book. The book of the law, the composition of the Pentateuch, the myths of Genesis, the Mosaic Code, the 10 Commandments, the idea of God, the Sabbath, the Jewish family, estimate of the Mosaic legislation. To build a military state was impossible. Judea had neither the numbers nor the wealth for such an enterprise. Since some system of order was needed that, while recognizing the sovereignty of Persia, would give the Jews a natural discipline and a national unity, the clergy undertook to provide a theocratic rule based, like Josiah's, on priestly traditions and laws promulgated as divine commands. About the year 444 B.C., Ezra, a learned priest, called the Jews together in solemn assembly and read to them from morn to midday the book of the law of Moses. This book is continued on cassette 10, side 1.